Please take a seat. Please take a seat, everyone. We're going to start.
Hello? 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 Hello?
Please
Your
take a seat,
attention,
everyone.
please. We are reconvening for our afternoon session. 2 p.m. afternoon session. Please take your seats.
It's my great privilege to introduce Mark Tooley, who you saw this morning. Mark has become a good friend and ally. He's the president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, which is sponsoring this conference. I thank him for sponsoring the conference. He has intellectual foresight and boldness, and I appreciate that about the Institute on Religion and Democracy. Let me just say, and maybe Mark, you can mention specifically, people are asking about two things. Number one, they're asking, is this being taped? Yes, it is. You can see it's being videotaped, and it's going to be available next week at the IRD website. So just go to the Institute on Religion and Democracy website, and you can find it there next week. And the other thing people are asking is, tell me about this book. Well, these papers are very, very short versions of 7,000 to 10,000 word chapters each, and there will be 2 to 4 more chapters besides these papers here. And the book will be published by InterVarsity Press with the same title as the title of the conference, probably. And it will probably be coming out either 2016 or 2017. So, Mark?
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you again, Jerry, for being the architect of this event. It was his brainchild, and we're the enfleshment of what he first imagined. Well, it's a little bit or slightly intimidating to address this kind of audience, which is as educated and well-informed as the panelists are and all the presenters are, and many of you know much more than what we know up here. But let me share a few items which hopefully will be new or novel to at least some of you, if not all of you. An unlikely founder of American Christian Zionism was a zealous Methodist preacher and businessman named William Blackstone, who was already mentioned several times earlier today, and I understand we have a couple of people who have written about him and his important work. And Blackstone, of course, was a dispensationalist and a restorationist, but I think as a Methodist, his beliefs were broader and wider than that. Although strange now to us, it was a natural stretch in the mid-19th century when mainline Protestants commonly assumed providential attention for nations and people groups, above all the American people, who were a sort of prototype of New Zion in their minds. Methodists, in particular, with their fixation on constant moral reform, had a natural affinity for outreach to the long-displaced and frequently tormented Jewish people. In 1890, as I believe someone has already mentioned, Blackstone hosted a conference on the past, present, and future of Israel at Chicago's First Methodist Episcopal Church, where church leaders and others implored the great powers, above all the Ottomans, who of course had control over the Holy Land, to return the Jews to their ancient homeland. A year later, Blackstone launched the Blackstone Memorial, urging American support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, aimed specifically at President Benjamin Harrison, himself an observant Presbyterian, and which was signed by hundreds of American notables, including soon-to-be President William McKinley, who was a devout Methodist, and business moguls like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Cyrus McCormick, who were respectively Northern Baptist, Episcopal, and Presbyterian. Blackstone's letter to President Harrison explained, "There seem to be many evidences to show that we have reached a period in the great roll of centuries when the everlasting God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is lifting up his hand to the Gentiles to bring his sons and his daughters from afar, that he may plant them again in their own land. Not for 24 centuries since the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, has there been offered to any mortal such a privileged opportunity to further the purposes of God concerning his ancient people." That's Blackstone, 1891. The movement he founded did not appreciably advance beyond that time, except that his adherents often spoke on behalf of persecuted Christians, especially in Russia, there was a major appeal to Teddy Roosevelt, for example, that Secretary of State Hay made an appeal to the Russian Tsar. But it wasn't until 1916 that Blackstone, although elderly at this time, reemerged in a larger way, and Jewish leaders successfully implored him to revive his 1891 memorial, this time for another Presbyterian president, this time Woodrow Wilson, and even gaining some official Presbyterian support for the memorial, which apparently was persuasive and which many believed helped to influence the administration to support Britain's Balfour Declaration during World War I. Blackstone Zionism comfortably melded with wider mainline Protestant interpretations of World War I as a divine instrument for chastening and reforming the nations, pushing them in the direction of God's ultimate kingdom. They thought there was a bishop named Samuel Spring from the Evangelical Church, which was a denomination in which Orville and Wilbur Wright's father was also a bishop and would later merge into Methodism decades later. And he spoke in Chicago during World War I at the Oakwood Park Assembly, in which he explained how God was using World War I to advance his purposes. And he said the cataclysm of World War had brought suffering, but also, quote unquote, a new birth. And he promised the audience, above the battle's roar and the cannon's thunder, one can hear the voice of the Almighty saying, "Behold, I make all things new." He went on to pronounce the war as a judgment upon the world and was confident that God, never intending that one man should rule the world, would ensure that Germany's warlord, the Kaiser, would fail too, with Germany ultimately freed from the tyrant's yoke. The bishop goes on to say that there would be the end of Russia's czar, and Russia was now ready for the gospel and for democracy in his view. He didn't seem to count the Russian Orthodox Church in his view of Christianity. And speaking before the Bolshevik takeover in a few months, he enthused that Russia is religiously free as a direct result of the war, and this alone is worth all that war has yet cost in blood and life and treasure. He also rejoiced that with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, the political significance of Islam will be broken. He foresaw that, quote-unquote, Mohammedan lands will be open to the gospel as never before, and thanks to British arms, the flag of a Christian nation now floats above Jerusalem. Britain had promised a homeland for the Jews, which the bishop saw as one of God's singular miracles emerging from the war. War is the surgeon's knife in God's hand for the purpose of delivering the nations from their imperiling sins, he said. Jehovah is a man of war, and this war is the thunder and crash of the irresistible march of progress. So that was mainstream Christian thinking in 1918, a little bit different from today. Christian Zionism, of course, continued after World War I, but began to evolve in different directions through groups. One in particular, whose name would be ironic to us today, called the Pro-Palestine Federation, which organized church leaders for Jewish return to Zion. In 1936, it gathered some major mainline Protestant leaders, including the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, D.C., to meet with the British ambassador, and they were claiming to represent what they called the consensus of enlightened Christian American opinion. And they were reminding the ambassador and his prime minister that the British government had essentially been the recipient of a responsibility that God had bestowed upon their land, one of the greatest missions in human history, the salvation of Israel and the restoration to its ancient patrimony. Also participating in that effort was Methodist Bishop Francis McConnell, a prominent liberal social gospel advocate and the founder of the Methodist Federation for Social Action, which is now today better known as an outspoken proponent of anti-Israel divestment, ironically. But at that point was urging Britain to fulfill its covenantal pledges about a Jewish homeland in Palestine. A few years later, in the late 30s, as the clouds of war were gathering in Europe, a similar group with some of the same people organized itself and with a much longer name called Christian Leaders, Clergymen, and Laymen on behalf of Jewish immigration into the Palestine Federation. That's all one name. And they declared that the destiny of the Jews is a matter of immediate concern to the Christian conscience, the amelioration of their lot a duty that rests upon all that profess Christian principles. And they were joined by people like, again, this Bishop McConnell and also an increasingly prominent German Reformed theologian at New York's Union Seminary named Reinhold Niebuhr. And this group described itself as committed to the establishment of a Jewish commonwealth in Palestine in relation to the overall settlement in the post-war era, already looking forward to the end of World War II, which had just barely begun, while urging as immediate policy the admission now of Jewish exiles into other countries, including the U.S., as well as Palestine. One of its seminary leaders, a Congregationalist, confidently exclaimed that as soon as the British see that list of men on our stationery, Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, Bishop McConnell, and others, they'll open the gates of Palestine and let those Jewish refugees come pouring in. Then we'll disband this committee. It's as simple as that, he said in 1938. Reinhold Niebuhr would go on during the war to write the following regarding this group's purpose. The Jews require a homeland, if for no other reason because even the most generous immigration laws of Western democracies will not permit all the dispossessed Jews of Europe to find a haven in which they may look forward to a tolerable future. Whether the Jews will be allowed to develop a genuine homeland under their own sovereignty within the framework of the British Empire depends solely upon the amount of support that they secure in the two great democracies. For those democracies will have it in their power, if Hitler is defeated, to make the necessary political arrangements. The Anglo-Saxon hegemony that is bound to exist in the event of an Axis defeat will be in a position to see to it that Palestine is set aside for the Jews, that the present restrictions on immigration are abrogated, and that the Arabs are otherwise compensated. That was Reinhold Niebuhr. And as one author has commented about Niebuhr and others at this time, the prominent mainline Protestant Zionists had, at this point, were no longer speaking so much theologically when they spoke about Israel, but they were speaking in terms of earthly political justice. So you see the influence of the social gospel. It was said that liberal sophisticates like Niebuhr thought Christian so-called fundamentalists were correct on Zionism, but only inadvertently. He would go on to write in the late 1950s, many Christians are pro-Zionist in the sense that they believe that a homeless people require a homeland, but we feel as embarrassed as anti-Zionist religious Jews when messianic claims are used to substantiate the right of the Jews to the particular homeland in Palestine. History is full of strange configurations. Among them is the thrilling emergence of the State of Israel. Liberal Protestants after World War II were mostly agreed with Niebuhr. New York Methodism, for example, in 1948, commended President Truman for quickly recognizing Israel and urged the UN to treat the attacking Arab states as a threat to world peace. Bishop Bromley Oxnam, a prominent Methodist, also head of the Federal Council of Churches, was actually awarded by a Jewish group for having stood with Israel in its stance for dignity and equality of opportunity. He was a strong Zionist. In the 1950s, the World Methodist Council joined other mainline Protestant officials in urging the Arab states to settle the 800,000 Arab refugees from the 1948 war. And of the Palestinians, those mainline churches said, led into flight from their homes by Arab leaders, they are prevented from seeking permanent rehabilitation by these same leaders who use existence of the problem as a weapon against the West and against Israel. Well, by the 1970s, obviously the situation is much evolved. Mainline Protestantism no longer seeing Israel as the underdog after the 1967 war, and increasingly enthralled by liberation theology, which assumed that Western nations like Israel were de facto oppressors of third world peoples, was shifting against Zionism. Liberal Protestant pronouncements reacting to the 1973 war, for example, were ambivalent at best. One mainline official said, the events of the last few years have tended to obscure the origin of the ongoing struggle in the Middle East. Behind the big power conferences, there are Israelis and Palestinians, two people who claim the same land, two people whose history in the 20th century includes horror, war, resistance, and survival. So striving for impartiality in that statement. By 1974, just a year after the 73 war, the Israeli government was boycotting a Methodist panel on the Middle East held at the Church Center for the United Nations, alleging that the program was biased towards the Arabs. I'm guessing they were probably correct in their critique and their reasons for boycotting. In 1975, mainline Protestant officials did mostly but deplore the UN's declaration equating Zionism with racism, although probably more out of concern for the UN's image than for the cause of Zionism. In 1976, the largest mainline denomination, the Methodists, for the first time officially took a stance in their General Conference regarding the Mideast, and they noted in their language that Israeli Jews live with insecurity amid a long history of oppression, culminating with the Holocaust, but it also cited Palestinian suffering, including arrests, tortures, and expulsions by Israelis. It affirmed self-determination for Jews and Palestinians, including a Palestinian state, while faulting the U.S. for ignoring what it called Palestinian aspirations, and it urged recognizing the PLO in 1976. By the 1980s, the mainline churches were actively supporting pro-PLO advocacy. There was even a group based in the Interchurch Center in New York, which was in the headquarters of the mainline churches, specifically devoted to PLO advocacy. In 1997, in the 1990s, mainline church voices were denouncing Jewish settlements, urging reconsideration of U.S. aid for Israel. In the 1990s, a Methodist volunteers and missions official denounced Israel's crackdown in response to Palestinian suicide bombers, accusing Israel of ethnic cleansing, racism, and the creating of a Jerusalem for Jews only. By the start of the 21st century, liberal Protestantism had not only abandoned Christian Zionism, it was denouncing it as heresy. In 2008, for example, the National Council of Churches released a special brochure called Why We Should Be Concerned About Christian Zionism to warn its 35-member denominations. And an official at the National Council had this to say: the danger of this ideology is that it is a manipulation of Christian scripture and teaching. Unfortunately, it has influence in American churches to the point where many well-meaning Christians are swayed to support particularly destructive directions in U.S. foreign policy with regard to the Mideast. Not typically concerned about upholding Orthodox theology, the National Council of Churches even claimed that Christian Zionists violate the traditional teachings of the church. An NCC news release summarized, Christian Zionism is a dangerous movement that distorts the teachings of the church, fosters fear and hatred of Muslims and non-Western Christians, and has negative consequences for Middle East peace. They go on to portray pro-Israel evangelicals as mindless zealots who are eager to precipitate the end times, not to mention being bigots and paranoid ignoramuses. That's my characterization, not the exact language. But the NCC perspective is echoed in even more strident terms by infamously anti-Israel Church of England priest Stephen Sizer, already referenced earlier today, whose book, Zion's Christian Soldiers, warns that in its worst forms, Christian Zionism uses the Bible to justify racial superiority, land expropriation, home demolitions, colonial settlements, the denial of international law, and the dehumanization of Arabs. He further explains that Christian Zionism also provides a biblical justification for U.S. intervention in the Middle East. It is deeply mistrustful of the United Nations and the European community and actively opposes the implementation of international law and the right of Palestinians to a sovereign state alongside Israel. For Stephen Sizer, Christian Zionism seems like a plague. He says it not only fuels Islamophobia, but also anti-Semitism and Islamist retaliation against Christians. His charge that pro-Israel Christians incite quote-unquote retaliation against Christians echoes a small but growing sentiment among some evangelicals in the U.S., but also in Britain and elsewhere, to oppose public critique of a jihadist Islam in favor of accommodation. Why have Britain and America become the focus of so much hatred from the Islamic world? Stephen Sizer further asked. Why are our countries the target of Islamist terrorism, despite our commitment to the rule of international law, democracy, and human rights? For him, the reasons are clear. The answers to these questions remain inexplicable unless we factor in what is now probably the most influential and destructive movement among Christians today, Christian Zionism. A much softer critique of Christian Zionism is offered by evangelicals in the U.S., like Lynn Hybels and groups like World Vision and Telos, who urge a policy of what they call pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-peace, pro-Jesus. This critique resents and often caricatures ostensibly simplistic and unquestioning support that Christian Zionists supposedly give Israel. They understand that U.S. evangelicals' historically pro-Israel views explain much of America's alliance with Israel, and they clearly hope that persuading many evangelicals into a more neutralist stance, at least, if not openly partial to Palestinian advocacy, could have significant geopolitical repercussions. During the recent Gaza conflict, for example, the head of Telos, who's here in Washington, D.C., expressed a sort of a therapeutic alternative to Christian Zionism and benignly blogged that a ceasefire is needed immediately. neither acts of terrorism nor aggressive military campaigns can displace the need for addressing the fundamental issues underlying the years of violence, as each side needs friends who will challenge them to do what is best for their own people, and at the same time who will encourage visionary leadership, which realizes that the future of the two people is interconnected, that neither is going away, that the pain of grieving mothers is always the same, and that freedom and security for one people cannot be found at the expense of the other. In a much more polemical vein, a film of several years ago aimed at evangelicals called With God on Our Side faults Christian Zionism for Palestinian suffering, for U.S. military adventurism, and for impeding Christian witness and evangelism among Israel's Arab adversaries. Articulating a harder-line, old-style version of liberation theology, still predominant in the mainline Protestant world, a Methodist theologian who was formerly Southern Baptist and formerly taught at a prominent evangelical school complained recently about Prime Minister Netanyahu's re-election, explaining succinctly, "My preferential option towards the Palestinians is because overall they are the ones who are suffering economic and political oppression. As a liberation theologian, I must stand with Palestinians while remaining ready to also criticize their policies." Along a similar vein, once again, last year, the Presbyterian Church USA, before adopting its anti-Israel divestment position, published a booklet, brochure called Zionism Unsettled, which faulted Christian Zionism because it fuses religion with politics, distorts faith, and imperils peace in the Middle East. Further, in its liberal Christian manifestation, Zionism serves as a price tag theology, providing Christians with a vehicle of repentance for the guilt accrued during centuries of European Christian anti-Semitism culminating in the Holocaust. In fact, Israeli and American myths of origin are similar and derived from the same biblical sources. This Presbyterian booklet goes on to note that the history and ideology of settler colonialism have been so central to the political history of the U.S. that it's not surprising that political and religious leadership of the U.S. has been predisposed to uncritical support of the Zionist movement. Well, it can be said at least that all of this liberal Protestant, mainline Protestant hostility to Christian Zionism, guided still, and across much of the last 40 years, by liberation theology, is at least concise and relatively consistent. You know exactly where they stand and why they do so. The more recent evangelical left critique is much more situational and therapeutic, claiming to be concerned about evangelism, which of course the liberal Protestants don't prioritize. And meanwhile, in an interesting twist, there is a neo-Anabaptist perspective to the ongoing critique of Christian Zionism, which overlaps the liberal Protestant and evangelical worlds and portrays Christian Zionism as an ideology of empire, war, and domination, largely a particularly sinister manifestation of Constantinianism, with Israel the prong of American militarism. In my view, none of these critiques of Christian Zionism really understand or seriously address the original 19th century and early 20th century American Christian Zionism, which, in rather simple terms, sought to restore a long displaced and tormented people to their ancient homeland as an act of restorative justice and for their ongoing protection from persecution, but also more widely to create a new Zion that would model political and economic justice to the world, as well as serve as an ongoing witness of God's faithful fulfillment of his promises. Blackstone the Methodist and his earnest adherents, mostly mainline Protestants working with Jewish colleagues in an early manifestation of interfaith collaboration, offered a vision of spiritual and moral beauty that the critics, whether harsh or therapeutic, cannot and have not matched. Thank you.
This perhaps will overlap a little bit with what Mark has done. My paper's called Reinhold Niebuhr on Israel, Complementing and Complementing His Argument. I, complementing, meaning agreeing and admiring, and complementing, E, meaning supplementing. So it's definitely a distinct honor to be here among these distinguished scholars and to be heard by such an important audience. My assignment was to develop a theologically based political argument for Christian Zionism. When I began my task, I thought I would develop my own Niebuhrian argument for the support of Christian Zionism. After all, I had mastered Reinhold Niebuhr's system of thought in graduate school, and I could still think like Niebuhr. But before I did that, I thought I probably should check out what Niebuhr himself had to say about Israel and Christian Zionism. I was astounded at how much he did say and how well he said it. I doubted whether I could improve on that all that much. I began to wonder why I had not seen the many articles he wrote about Israel. Most of his books, which I had read closely, were written about other political issues. He wrote copiously in many journals about Israel, however. Strangely enough, the many compilations of his journalistic articles did not contain the ones in which he dealt with Israel. Further, secondary literature about Niebuhr strangely contained little discussion of his support for Israel. His biographer, Richard Fox, barely mentions the many efforts Niebuhr made on behalf of Israel. Most of these compilations do not even list Israel in their index. So on further reflection, however, this dearth of references was not so strange. From the 50s onwards, many of Niebuhr's liberal and socialist friends gradually withdrew their support from Israel. This departure became a flood after the 6 Days War in 1967. Among his mainstream Protestant friends and students, Niebuhr's support for Israel was something of an embarrassment, and they simply did not include his writings on that subject in their compilations and commentaries. But these writings certainly are extant, and upon reading them, I became ever prouder to have Niebuhr as my theological mentor. Moreover, as I got deeper into the discussion of Israel and Christian Zionism among Christians over many decades, I discovered that the arguments for and against really hadn't changed all that much. Those Christians, including Niebuhr, who robustly supported Israel and Christian Zionism, and those who opposed them, employed pretty much the same arguments. There was a perennial field to the arguments of both sides. Certainly the situations and the various players changed. The major threat was no longer Egypt, but rather Iran. But the arguments were similar. So it made more sense to recover Niebuhr's persuasive arguments than to project my own. Further, I found that long after his death, Niebuhr's name had been resurrected to play a role in a contemporary debate about the Presbyterian Churches USA's program entitled Zionism Unsettled, which debunks the great support Niebuhr and his colleague Paul Tillich gave to the new state of Israel. Rising to the occasion, Niebuhr's daughter and his grandnephew, Gustav Niebuhr, offer a rousing defense of their forebears' Zionist sympathies. Joining in the same debate, several rabbis offer appreciative remarks about Niebuhr's contribution to the Zionist cause and pose the plaintive question, where is Niebuhr among mainstream Protestants when we need him? In the following, I'm going to outline and identify myself with the remarkable and admirable arguments that Niebuhr made in support of Israel and Christian Zionism. Later on, I will offer my own additions to supplement Niebuhr's arguments. I call it complementing his arguments, though I'm not absolutely sure that Niebuhr would accept what I'm adding. Niebuhr was curiously inattentive to the religious element in both Jewish and Christian Zion cases for a Jewish state. And he certainly did not take seriously enough the concern for the land deeply ingrained in the religious visions of many sorts of both Christian and Jewish Zionists. I want to add both concerns, the religious element and its concern for the land, to my overall argument. That's supplementing or complementing Niebuhr. But before I get into the outline of his argument, I want to give a glimpse of Reinhold Niebuhr's remarkable record as a pastor, theologian, and activist in the Zionist cause. During his 14-year pastorate in Detroit from 1915 to 29, when he took a position at Union, when he was a very young man, he already supported a Zionist approach to Palestinians' ultimate settlement. In 1933, he had already deciphered Hitler's plans for liquidating the Jews and pled for a refuge for the Jews in Palestine. By 1941, he founded Christianity in Crisis, which featured many pro-Zionist writers. He criticized the British for limiting Jewish immigration at Palestine in the early 40s. He joined Christian Zionist organizations, befriended many Jewish Zionist leaders and spoke at their assemblies, and helped found the Christian Council on Palestine in 1942. And that same year, he wrote an incredible article which caused a furor and which precipitated a division in Protestantism that lasts to this day. In Jews After the War, he vigorously promoted a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, even as he encouraged states to protect the Jewish communities that remained in the diaspora. He chastised the West for not offering more support for Jews in the run-up to World War II. He supported Israel at the critical time of the Suez Crisis, when many more mainline Protestants abandoned her, and celebrated the Six-Day War victory in 1967, even when more demurred. Because of his heroic Zionism, the Hebrew University in 1969 suspended its policy of giving honorary doctorates only to those who were physically present. The president of the university journeyed to the homebound Niebuhr to give it to him personally. His response: "I am a friend of the Jewish people and have never ceased to be favorable to the state of Israel." At his death, a party of distinguished Israeli officials came to his funeral, at which Abraham Joshua Heschel offered the eulogy. After his death in 1971, his wife Ursula continued his efforts in support of Israel, even as many other mainline Protestants took quite a different tack. Complimenting Niebuhr, how I agree with him. Now his arguments, which embrace both a hard-nosed realist and a Christian realist, claims in support of Israel. His arguments are deeply anchored in his theological anthropology, which I cannot unpack at this time. I offer only the barest outlines of his case, both realist and Christian realists, that he made for Christian Zionism. Niebuhr's argument for a strong support of Israel by American Christians and the U.S. government began with a hard-nosed realist assessment of Israel's role in promoting the American national interest. In Niebuhr's era, Israel provided stability and order. It was an important ingredient in balancing various powers so that both tyranny and anarchy in the Middle East could be avoided. It helped to resist Soviet power in the Middle East and was an outpost for expressing American power and influence. It deserves strong support, including military support. But his argument was enriched by a Christian component that related Christian love creatively but realistically to, number one, compassionate and penitent solutions to the need for suffering Jews around the world to find shelter. Number two, to the creative effort to establish a homeland for a special people with a unique history. And number three, to extend democracy in the world. But these creative efforts were conditioned by a deep sense of the realities on the ground, the complex interplay of self-interested nations, the continuing vehemence of Arab resistance, and the need for Israel to survive and flourish among these realities. He never wavered in his support for Israel, and he thought his support was on strong Christian grounds. My complimenting Niebuhr, complimenting. However, wishing to avoid dispensationalist and social gospel rationales for establishing a homeland for the Jews in Israel, and blinded by a mild supersessionism, Niebuhr generally avoided a biblical justification for establishing such a homeland. He came close at times, and he certainly had a great respect for Judaism, so much so that he thought Christians should not evangelize Jews. Had he lived after the large shift in Christian thinking about the continuing nature of God's covenant with Israel and its promise of the land, and had he the benefit of hearing the talks we have heard today, Niebuhr would, I think, add such a rationale to his support for Israel. If St. Paul's belief in such a continuing covenant had been emphasized in his time, I suspect Niebuhr would have been convinced. So I have complimented Niebuhr by adding a theological biblical rationale to support for Israel. God continues providentially to care about the Jewish people and their future in the land, to which the Jews have the right and opportunity to return. If God cares, Christians ought to care also. My conclusion, and I will try to bring Niebuhr's arguments into the present. They are yet convincing against the same sort of arguments made by the critics and opponents of Israel then and now. Of course, the players and the countries are different, but the arguments are essentially the same. Niebuhr would argue that a strong support for Israel is in our national interest. He would argue that Israel is an oasis of order in a turbulent part of the world and contributes to the balance of power that is always in danger of breaking down. It provides a strong edge of resistance to that aspiring imperial power, Iran, and is a conduit of American interest in power. But that hard-nosed realism wouldn't be enough for Niebuhr. His Christian convictions would lead him to support Israel as a continuing haven for persecuted Jews from around the world. He was prescient that anti-Semitism would continue to harass and kill Jews in Europe, even after the Holocaust. So European Jews are thinking seriously about migrating to Israel. Other Jewish communities are also under great stress. Jews still need a homeland on the grounds of compassion. He would also argue that Israel must be supported because it is the one place in the world and in most of history where Jews can be the subject of their own history, not merely the object of someone else's toleration. He would find those who have switched sides starkly seeing the Palestinians now as the oppressed and the Israelis as the oppressor. They have indulged in a horrible misjudgment and injustice. If Israel gives up its capacity for self-determination, being a subject of its own history, it's a goner. Niebuhr would support Israel because of its commitment to democracy and human rights, not that it's perfect, but that its democracy aims, as he put it in defining democracy, as searching for proximate solutions for insoluble problems. Israel has enough insoluble problems, but it's working on them. Its minorities are gradually gaining more justice, status, and power thanks to democratic processes. Israeli Arabs prefer citizenship in Israel over any surrounding country. Progress is being made. But he identified his major opponent as the liberal universalist. His phrase, he contends repeatedly and heatedly with that critic of Israel. The liberal universalists cannot see the powerful vitalities of history that are irrational and implacable. The resistance of the Palestinians and Arabs and Persians to Israel's very existence. They believe that participants in the struggle are finally rational and people of goodwill. Tolerance is needed. Israel needs to relax and bargain. And the liberal idealists cannot understand that in such a precarious situation, Israel has to take measures that a country in a normal situation would not have to take, building a wall and maintaining a military control of the West Bank. So they punish Israel for the crucial things it needs to do to survive and live relatively normally. Above all, liberal universalism despises the claim of nations to be exceptional. President Obama famously declared that America is exceptional like Greeks and Danes think their nation is exceptional. Yet Americans persist in seeing their nation as exceptional, one in which the American dream, equality of opportunity, is offered to all, and one which bears a special democratic mission in the world. A nation so conceived and so dedicated should not perish from the earth. Lincoln's statement about America is what Niebuhr said about Israel, which he thought was exceptional. Its role as a homeland for oppressed Jews who have long searched for the necessity and the opportunity of return, its role as a host to a people who have persisted as an ethnic, cultural, and religious community over 2 millennia, again always looking toward a homeland 3 times a day, and I would add its role as a shelter for the covenanted people of God whose covenant includes the land. The liberal universalist vision of a kingdom of ends guided by universal reason floats like a phantasm over historical realities, neither understanding nor defending them when it's called for. Let Niebuhr have the final word. Quote, "We ought to recognize that among the many illogical emergents of history, that is, configurations which do not fit into our logic, there is the strange miracle of the Jewish people, outliving the hazards of the diaspora for 2 millennia and finally offering their unique and valuable contributions to the common Western civilization and the state. We should not ask that this peculiar historical miracle fit into any kind of logic or conform to some historical analogy. It has no analogy. It must be appreciated for what it is." Deep appreciation for this miracle defines Reinhold Niebuhr's Christian Zionism and mine. Thank you.
Okay. So this session is, I think, where everyone was trying to go this morning, or at least partially. The question before us is, does the modern state of Israel violate the call to justice in the covenant by its relation to international law? It's a controversial question, it's a loaded question, it's an important question. It arises, Jerry and the organizers of the conference didn't just make this up. This arises from accusations made by several Christian thinkers and scholars, noted ones, who, in trying to largely deconstruct Christian Zionism, aver that by Israel, by virtue of its breach of international law, has violated the terms of justice in the covenant and thereby forfeited its right, or is about to forfeit its right, to live in the land of promise. So I think a legal analysis of Israel, a justice analysis, is a sound one. It's a good idea. Not enough Christians, I think about the ethical dimensions of Israel's existence and all of the conflict in the land. They sort of see it as something special and mysterious, but just kind of leave it at that. I think it's a responsible inquiry. And we know that there must be red lines. You know, if Israel was lining up every non-Jew in the land and systematically executing them, which of course they don't do, we clearly as Christians could not support that. So there's some sort of red line there. And so the question is, you know, let's walk that back. Where is the red line? Where are the red lines? Is Israel crossing the red lines? And I think some theologians are making this case about covenantal justice, that this is the red line. This is the plumb line, and you know, obedience to international law is an indication of rightful possession or illegitimate possession. I think, and I will make the claim, that this argument is highly suspect, to say the least. I think it's unfounded. Furthermore, I think it's irresponsible. I think it's a dangerous use of interpretation of the biblical text to justify a political position. Applying a legal analysis to Israel's behavior is fine, even fitting, but this analysis needs to be circumscribed. It needs to be apprised of all the facts. It needs to be emptied of its apocalyptic insinuations of Jews being vomited out of the land, which is what you read quite a bit of. So in the book that follows from this conference, I'll make much more of an affirmative sort of case, you know, legally, but today I think it's important, due to the limits of time, to do a little bit of deconstruction of my own in terms of the question itself, and I think this is really important. So I'll confine my comments to sort of a preliminary type, addressing what I see to be the problematic essence of this question. And so I'm asking, what is international law, what is covenantal justice, and how can these concepts be applied to modern Israel, if at all? It's a question of theology, but the answer bears significant weight in the world of affairs, as we all know. So the accusation, most people who accuse Israel of illegality, sort of, if you boil it all down, there's sort of three moments or themes that you can sort of trace things back to. One is the 1948 situation, that Israel was founded, that was unfair, that was wrong. The next is 1967, that Israel's acquisition and subsequent management of territories gained in the Six-Day War is also wrong. And also there's the third sort of Israel's ongoing behavior in the land. It's not being just, it's, you know, there's no rule of law, no due process. Christian scholars add that Israel, in breaching one or all of these positions, has breached the biblical covenant. You hear about Ahab seizing the vineyard of Naboth. I mean, this is repeated constantly. A few quotes. Gary Burge, possession of the land is linked with covenant fidelity. To break the law is to lose the land. And to be sure, the nation of Israel has promised possession of the land as an everlasting gift, but this promise is conditional. It depends on Israel's fidelity to the covenant and its stipulations. When Israel refuses to act in this manner, i.e. righteously, the nation jeopardizes its own claim to life in the land. A group of evangelical leaders wrote a letter to George Bush in 2007 and said, perhaps the best way we can bless Israel is to encourage her to remember, as she deals with her neighbor Palestinians, the profound teaching on justice that the Hebrew prophets proclaim so forcefully as an inestimably precious gift to the whole world. Kairos, Palestine. Our land is God's land, as is the case with all countries in the world. It is our duty to liberate it from the evil of injustice and war. It is God's land, and therefore it must be a land of reconciliation, peace, and love. N.T. Wright says, to this day there are Jews living in Palestinians' homes, tilling their fields, sleeping in their beds, eating off their china, quite likely quoting Deuteronomy to back it all up. Houses you did not build, fields you did not plant, vineyards you did not grow. Colin Chapman, while the promise and gift of the land were unconditional, their continued possession of the land was conditional and depended on their loyalty and obedience to the God who had given it to them. Speaking of the Mosaic Law, two aspects of this law are particularly relevant to the issue of land in recent history. One concerns the seriousness of theft and murder, while the other has to do with treatment of foreigners or aliens in the land. When seen in the light of the idea of the chosen people as it developed in the Old Testament, the modern Jewish state looks more like a step backwards than a step forwards. If Jews appeal to the Abrahamic promise as the title deed which gives them the right to the land for all times, they automatically put themselves under the authority of the law of Moses. The more they seek to interpret what has happened in the land in light of the divine promises, the more they should be willing for their actions to be judged in the light of divine law. A few more. Stephen Sizer. Israel is a materialistic and apartheid state practicing repressive and dehumanizing measures against the Palestinians in flagrant disregard of the United Nations and UN Declaration of Human Rights. He quotes Leviticus 18:24 through 28, and God's requirement to, quote, keep my decrees and laws or else be vomited out of the land. And he says, on this basis of such a passage, the present brutal, repressive, and apartheid policies of the state of Israel would suggest another exile on the horizon rather than a restoration. Mitri Rahib is a Lutheran cleric in the land. He goes further, says the Jews don't need to treat him as a resident alien with kindness because they're the resident alien and he's the actual rightful possessor. Israel, like all empires, he says, holds to a, quote, imperial theology, a higher logic in which, quote, the violation of human rights needs to have something akin to divine purpose, to be set within an ideological and theological framework. Last but not least, somebody I respect very much, John Piper. John Piper writes, today, Israel as a nation is a covenant-breaking people. They are rejecting their Messiah, Jesus. In this condition of unbelief and disobedience, she has no divine right to the land of promise. Now, Piper is a little bit more responsible and hedges by saying, you know, they may not have a divine right, but they may have rights like other nations. But that doesn't soften the blow of the accusation. So the conclusion, if you read these works and you don't know anything else about anything going on in the land, you think Jews are misbehaving, they're treating the land and its inhabitants unjustly, therefore they merit being vomited out of the land. Whether we do it or someone else does it, it could happen, and maybe it's even the right thing to do. So is it true? You know, what are the problems in this question? The first problem, I would say, is international law, and anybody here who has legal training can verify, it's quite an ambiguous thing. Anyone who says international law says or clearly says hasn't looked at international law because it doesn't clearly say anything, actually. The term is often invoked as evidence of some sort of higher law, something written in the heavens. International law has this emotional mythology that has nothing to do with what international law actually is. Gerhard von Glahn, who wrote a seminal introductory text on international law, wrote, international law represents not law above nations or supranational law, but law among nations, jus inter gentes. It's not monolithic. The term itself is filled with ambiguity. Grotius, who's often called the father of international law, in the opening lines of his magnum opus, The Rights of War and Peace, he divides what he calls the law of nations into rules derived from nature, rules of divine command in Scripture, custom, and tacit consent between sovereign governments. And one of his central tasks in writing that book was to disentangle those different pieces. So today, if you talk about international law, you're really talking about two things. That is treaties, voluntary treaties between nations, and custom. It is the things that all countries do regularly with the sense that their activity is conforming to a sense of legal obligation. So the key points I just want to make here, and I won't belabor this point, is international law, one, it's a mostly voluntary system comprised of two largely unenforceable rules. Three, it's entered into by fallible and self-interested states that are, four, to some extent, arbitrary, that is the rules. And number five, they're subject to change. This is not something that's written in stone somewhere. This is contractual in nature, and it's constantly in flux. That's not to say international law is not important, that it governs conduct, it provides order and stability, a thin layer of morality and interstate relations, and to some extent sort of embodies the natural law and biblical law principles that we all hold dear. And it's not to say it's not binding with respect especially to treaties. States that enter into them through their own consent should perform their obligations, but it's a key point. Failure to do so is effectively breach of contract, not breach of the cosmic order in some existential sense. There are touch points between these various pieces of law, but they're not coextensive, they're not coterminous, and they never have been. For example, the law of occupation, which is such a huge part of the conflict. The law of occupation is not something of ancient nature. It was devised in the late 19th century, largely under the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, and then reinforced in the Geneva Conventions. And it's consensual, it's contractual, it's not immutable. It is the rules for when occupations start, when they end, what happens in them, what everybody's obliged to do. It was devised by people and signed, and that's it. My next point is not only is international law sort of an ambiguous idea, but covenantal justice, I would suggest, especially in the New Testament era, and especially as it applies to a secular state of Israel, not a Hebrew theocracy, is incredibly ambiguous and problematic. Christians who make arguments based on biblical justice tend to paint with these broad strokes, and I think the stakes are a bit too high to do that here. Old Testament, no doubt, is filled with ethical and moral admonitions, but and many of these carry into the New Testament. And in the Old Testament, admittedly, possession of the land is linked to, it does have a conditional aspect, is linked to ethics and largely related to the keeping of God's law. But there are so many questions that one could ask. Which covenant are we talking about? What is the precise relationship between the unilateral, unconditional Abrahamic covenant and the conditional, bilateral provisions of the Mosaic covenant? Which parts of the covenant continue to apply after the new covenant? Are we going with moral or civil or ceremonial or all? How is breach determined? Who determines it, and what's the remedy? How does the covenant relate to voluntary positive law that we have in the world today? Is there danger to applying the laws of Sinai to modern conflicts between peoples? I'm not going to answer all of those questions here. I'm not a theologian. But you can see there are deep, deep complexities. The Abrahamic covenant promised the land unilaterally, and the Mosaic covenant made possession of the land conditional in some sense. It talked about fair dealings with resident aliens, but how those two covenants interact, how they've been impacted since the implementation of the new covenant, which parts now apply, and to whom are very difficult theological questions, and there's no universal consensus. And I submit that they should remain a very interesting topic in the realm of theology, and I hope it stays there. I'm going to brush over this point briefly, but I would argue, first of all, that Israel has not committed substantive, material, gross violations of positive international law, that is, treaties and custom, in its relationship to either the people or the land, certainly not enough to bring in an existential inquiry of Israel's right to exist. Israel is, I would argue, one of the most legally observant nations there are, certainly aspiring to be that. The establishment of Israel was one of the most legally regulated establishments of any country in history, certainly until that time. People think the Balfour Declaration, when Britain made a promise to Lord Rothschild, was this, a letter sent to, this letter was incorporated into the San Remo Resolution. It was incorporated into the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, approved by virtually every country then in existence under the League of Nations. It was ratified through various committees, and there were all kinds of study groups, and the United Nations General Assembly in Resolution 181 recognized a rightful Jewish sovereignty, and for a whole host of other reasons, the founding of Israel was not in contravention to international law, certainly at that time. Resolution 242 in 1967, the UN Security Council said, and Resolution 242, give back territories taken in that war, Israel. And this is often cited as Israel's in violation of international law. The reality is Israel gave back virtually all of the territory and has offered to give back virtually all of the rest of it. It took 26,178 square miles. Almost immediately, or about a decade later, gave back 88.5% of that to Egypt. And subsequent, I can go through the numbers, but I won't. It is virtually 97% of all the territories, and part of which, those territories, has a significant Palestinian self-governing autonomous region within it. The Fourth Geneva Convention, the transfer of population and settlements, so much of the legal critique of Israel comes down to one clause in one of the Geneva Conventions, and that's Article 49.6. I won't go into that, but maybe it'll come up in questions. There's significant reason to think that either the Geneva Convention doesn't apply to those territories, and even if it does, that it is not even a violation to build Jewish homes. Apartheid is another charge I won't get into, but we can raise it during questions. So even if, arguendo, Israel has committed substantive violations of international law, I'll concede the point. This doesn't necessarily imply violation of covenantal justice. As I said, these two things, whatever they are not coterminous. The covenantal analysis passes over a host of hermeneutical problems. Justice itself is only one small part of the covenant. Many other demands are at play. Is whether it's the full letter of the Mosaic Law or some parts of it, or just sort of the net ethical vision of the Old Testament, nobody knows. There's a tremendous amount of abstraction on the table that is way too vague to be applied to real-world affairs. And there's certainly a call to justice, no doubt. And I think the Jews recognize this, and some of the biggest critics of Israel's policies are Jewish, but it's insufficiently determinate to make serious accusations. But even if, I'll concede that point as well, even if Israel has violated covenantal justice through international law, it is not up to human beings or human states to make that determination, much less to enforce a remedy or suggest one. God made the covenant with the Jews. God is the ultimate judge of their performance under the covenant. He's also the ultimate enforcer of their punishment or lack thereof. God is the only one who's going to decide whether the Jews are fulfilling their obligations, and only He, as He's done before, is going to expel them from the land if He chooses to do that. What then is the role of the nations? When God depicts Israel failing in Scripture, both at the contemporary time it's written and in the future, He depicts really the nations looking on in horror. It's a proverb and a byword, and it's shocked that the God of Israel would do this to His own people. They're not actively planning and participating or prodding along her punishment, certainly not intentionally. And those nations who do participate in Scripture in the misery of Israel are all judged severely, even when God sort of prompts their moving. Edom, Amalek, Assyria, Babylonia, you can argue the Romans. Accusing Israel of violating this very important moral vision of the biblical covenant is dangerous. There's a great danger of applying biblical law to real-world affairs. Theologians have to do their jobs, they have to do theology, but they should avoid this kind of presumptuous conclusion-making that I read to you earlier. The world is listening, and I think Christians should be very aware of that. It's irresponsible, it's incoherent, it's conclusive, leads to suggestions of severe remedies with concrete applications. It provides justifications for Israel's opponents to act on their dark desires. It doesn't just discourage Christians, which I think is the original intention of walking back their sort of uncritical support of Israel. It sets the state of Israel, not just theological Israel, it puts it in a state of some kind of cosmic rebellion that exceeds the bad behavior of every other state in the world. Israel's perceived to be poking God in the eye. And what that does to people who hear that message is hard to say, and where it will go is actually very worrisome. It certainly doesn't build any bridges of friendship between Christians and Jews, that's for sure. So a legal analysis of Israel is not a covenantal analysis. This is an analysis that has been done and will be done in heaven by the perfect judge. So how do you judge Israel? Subjecting Israel to a legal analysis isn't wrong, as I said, but it should be, one, it should be circumscribed. Two, it should be done only after a rigorous investigation of the facts. Two, operate with an informed view of what international law actually is and says. Avoid invocation of biblical laws and covenants, and this whole idea of trying to be prophetic to the Jews. And five, it should be the same standard that is applied to all of the other nations who are signatory to these international law treaties. It should take into consideration the unique circumstances surrounding the Jews in the land, not ignoring Palestinians by any means, and certainly not ignoring the rule of law, but keeping everything in perspective. Colin Chapman, in his sort of seminal book, writes, and he's sort of asking this sarcastically, How has it happened, he says, that the Jews in Israel, after returning to their land and creating a Jewish state in order to escape from oppression elsewhere, have found themselves in a position of having to take harsh measures to deal with the aliens in their midst? And it's a good question, but not when it's asked sarcastically. I think those prone to ask those sorts of questions should ask them, and ask them sincerely, studying the law, studying the history of the region, to understand how Israel has in fact come to this very tragic situation in which it has to live on the land, be constantly defending itself from those who wish to destroy it, and trying its best to enforce some measure of justice and rule of law along the way. And thank you. I welcome your questions afterward.
Hey, good afternoon. In ancient times, when the first fruits offsprings were brought to the temple, the Jews recited the following verse from Deuteronomy 65:5, Arami Oved Avi, which means, my father was wandering Aramean. Jesus himself must have surely spoken these words when he visited the temple. The Bible speaks of Jacob as Aramean before God gave him the name Israel and made him the father of the holy nation, his chosen people. God made an everlasting covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will make of you a great nation and will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curse you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Genesis 12:3. God promised to preserve the Jewish people for all times and to give them the land of Israel forever. This holy land is forever connected to the Jewish people through the oath he swore to the fathers and the unconditional promises he made to the people of Israel. The Bible is full of evidence for this truth, from Genesis to the prophets and the New Testament. There is no doubt that Israel and the Jewish people have a central role in God's salvation plan, and that the regathering of the Jews from all nations in the world to the land of Israel was God's work and the fulfillment of the prophecies in the Bible. Israel was and still a Bavat Eno, which means the apple of God's eye. Today, we Arameans, as a Christian minority in Israel with a long presence and history in the region, we support Israel and love the Jewish people, to which we have close ethnic and religious ties. We even call our sons Israel, showing our passion and connection to God's chosen people. We have the same roots and from one family. Many ancient Jewish traditions survived in our Aramaic Syriac churches, even traditions from the Jewish temple. We speak Aramaic, the language of the Jews at the time of Jesus, and we pray in it. We have many reasons to bless Israel theologically, historically, and ethnically. We feel deeply connected to Israel and to the Jewish people. The question is, how does Israel treat us as non-Jewish minority? How does Israel treat non-Jews in general? Does Israel violate common moral values or norms? The state of Israel recognized us last year as Arameans in September 16, 2014, as a distant ethnic and religious group. This means that Israel recognized the existence of Christian people within its borders, something no Arab Muslim nation from the Middle East has ever done or would ever do. Israel supports us and legally gives us the right to exist and to develop ourselves as a Christian minority. This alone proves how fair and just Israel treats us as minority, not only as Christians. Israel is a democratic country and grants full civil rights, freedom, and liberty to all its citizens, no matter whether they are Jews or non-Jews. Israel not only grants its minority full rights, it strengthens also minority communities through a variety of state-sponsored programs. To me, as an Aramean Christian citizen born in Israel, an absolutely moral, just, and fair country. As I was 19 years old, as a young paratrooper Christian lieutenant, I led almost 100 young Jewish soldiers in the field. I was in charge for all their needs. The IDF and, of course, the Israeli Zionist Jewish system trusted my loyalty and my leadership as Aramaic Christian Maronite citizen and put in my hands the most precious thing, which is life of one young Jewish soldiers right after finishing high school. I acted like their father while we were away from home 3 years of military service. The same mutual treatment our 1,500 Christian soldiers are receiving today from young Jewish Zionist officers. Moreover, I have filled many different positions, enjoying from freedom and job opportunities and acting like any Israeli who wishes to have a successful career. Israel is consistent with its moral and democratic policy and allows all its citizens to enjoy from its freedom. Regarding the position of the state towards its minorities, Prime Minister Netanyahu stated, Israel minorities, including over 1 million citizens who are Arabs, always have full citizen rights. Israel's government will never tolerate discrimination against women. Israel's Christian population will always be free to practice their faith. This is the only place in the Middle East where Christians are fully free to practice their faith. They don't have to fear. They don't have to flee. In a time where Christians are under siege in so many places, in so many lands in the Middle East, I am proud that in Israel, Christians are free to practice their faith and that there's a thriving Christian community in Israel. I have personally met with the Prime Minister, and I can assure you that these words are true. The Christians and other minorities in Israel prosper and grow, while in other countries in the Middle East, they suffer heavily and disappear. To remind all of you, Israel was the first country to send its troops and sacrifice its Jewish soldiers for saving the only Christian country in the Middle East and Christians' stronghold in Lebanon from Arab persecution in Lebanon in 1982, while all Western countries stand aside, include the UN. This proves that the common deep feelings, care, and destiny the Zionist Jewish country feels toward Christian people in Israel and surrounding it, especially those Lebanese Christian Maronites who blessed the people of Israel in their hush time during the Second World War and the Arab persecutions since early 30s of the last century. It exists actually in the Zionist archive in Jerusalem, a research by Dr. Edmund Meir from 1942 about this specific issue. Therefore, the recognition of our people proves that Israel is indeed a democratic country based on moral values. The recognition would not be possible if Israel was not a democratic state, pluralistic country. It is a great history step. Through this, Israel acknowledges our common roots and strengthens our community. No other country in the world has done that before. But instead of honoring this historic Christian Aramaic recognition by the government of Israel, the Arab side, including some Christian dhimmis, representatives, and the international media, again blamed and demonizes Israel for its recognition of Christian Arameans, for which I fought so hard for so many years. This is neither fair nor moral, nor does it tell the truth. It always shows that those who criticize Israel are not driven by the concern for minorities or justice, but merely by hatred against the Jewish state. It was not the Jews which came up with this idea. I lobbied this for many years, I can tell you 7 years. And I worked many years to achieve that decision, and I was even received by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who supports us. Israel responded positively to our request and acted according to human rights and human minority. Let me ask one question. How long have the Arameans tried to gain legal status in Turkey to get the minority rights guaranteed in Lausanne Treaty and are still refused by Turkey? How much blame did Turkey get from the international community for refusing what is guaranteed by the international treaty? Not even one. What is the result of such a policy? There are almost no Arameans left in Turkey. Israel's non-Jewish minorities are granted full civil and political rights and are entitled complete participation in Israeli society. They are active in Israeli social, political, and civic life and enjoy representation in Israel parliament, foreign service, and judicial system. We as Christians are also joining the Israeli Defense Forces or running for Knesset elections like I did last elections just done two months ago. If we want, we can be full part of the Israeli society, and my work is to strengthen this attitude and help Christians to integrate even more. The State of Israel welcomes us to do so and is very happy if we participate and integrate into its society. Israel sincerely wants friends, not enemies, as David Ben-Gurion stated in 1947. Ben-Gurion also supported in 1954 the idea of creating a Christian state in Lebanon as a safe haven for persecuted Christians of the Middle East. This shows how sensitive Israeli leaders are regarding the protection of vulnerable Christians in the Middle East. Ben-Gurion, the father of the State Independence Declaration, signed in 1947 written agreement with the Maronite Patriarch in Lebanon for 2 national homelands that would give shelter and protection for persecuted minorities in the Middle East, a Christian home in the Lebanon and a Jewish home in Palestine, in Israel today. Both will have open relations and peace and act as a bridge between West and East from culture and civilization perspective. Peace and morality for others is the dream of the Zionists. Peace and security for Christians in the Lebanon and in Israel, and even for Arab regimes that are willing to live peacefully with the Jewish state, like Jordanian. The State of Israel is doing everything to integrate its non-Jewish citizens. Today, many organizations in Israel are working toward improving coexistence among Jews, Arabs, and other minorities like the Arameans. The government and the state institutions support such organizations and programs like our Aramaic Christian Association activities, national recognition. This shows the position of Israel toward its minorities. Why should the state support Arameans and other Christians integrate into society if not for moral and ethical standards? I wonder if Iran or any Muslim state has a single program for the benefit of Christian or other minorities. On the contrary, Christians are being killed and persecuted in Muslim countries ever since. The number of Christians and Palestinian Arabs has grown since the establishment of Israel. There are about 160,000 Christians living in Israel. Arabs who stayed in Israel now number more than 1.5 million. They have full rights of citizens and even serve in the Knesset, even though they don't show loyalty to the state and cursing it in every opportunity. They have more freedom of speech and religion than in any other Arab country in the Middle East. In Israel, a Christian or even a Muslim can be elected as a prime minister. Only in Israel you can find members of parliament acting or siding with the enemies of the country without facing threat by all means. They side with terrorists and still are protected by law or act against the security forces which defend all citizens of the country to keep it secure and protected, allowing them to live peacefully among each other. Israel allows Christians many rights that other Christians in Arab countries can only have in their sweetest dreams. In Israel, a Christian lieutenant can lead Jewish young soldiers to many missions and be in charge of their life. Israeli Christians are well respected and treated, and the majority of them are siding with the long-lasting Israel. According to a census done by Haifa University lately, 84% of Israeli Christians, numbering 160,000, want to integrate into the Israeli Jewish society, and 74% have no problem serving in military or civil service. Even though Palestinians do not want to integrate and be part of Israel, viewing this country as their enemy, Israel still supports the Arabs in preserving their cultural heritage, language, and religion. For example, the Arab-speaking minority has a representative in the special department of the Israeli Ministry of Education, responsible for the promotion of identity, roots, language, and religion of Arabs in the country. The state developed programs together with representatives from the Palestinian Arab community to teach Arabic and Islamic history, while Israel is always unjustifiably accused of ethnic cleansing and other crimes. It strengthens and preserves the culture of those who want to wipe out the state. Israel tries to promote the idea of civil service for non-Jews. The Arab Palestinians categorically rejected this idea, rejecting any responsibility within the society. We as Aramean Christians are enlisted in civil service lately and even volunteer in the IDF. A democratic state like Israel, understanding the sensitive position and needs of Arab Muslims and other indigenous minorities such as Aramaic Christians, deserve to be supported by all nations and especially by all its citizens. the moral and democratic standards of Israel are unique. Scarcely you can find a country in a constant state of war since its existence, treating citizens siding with its enemies in such moral and tolerant way, and allowing them to support sometimes terrorist groups and their actions against Israel youth and soldiers. Lately, growing number of Israeli Christians have been speaking out with a new voice and called for integration into Israeli Jewish society. At the same time, many of us are asking for halt to the cynical use of local Christians as pawns in the Palestinian cause or other Arab efforts to destroy Israel as a democratic Jewish state. Like the majority of Israeli Christians, I feel that many church leaders are betraying the Christian message and ignoring the rights of fellow Christians in the Holy Land in service to Islamic propaganda against our country, Israel. To see Christian leaders participating in anti-Israel political conferences like Christ at the Checkpoint makes me very angry. I am ashamed of the duplicity of these leaders in Israel, these Christians who enjoy full rights and freedom, even the freedom of the publicly slander the state without fear. By contrast, they and their families would quickly be killed for so publicly criticizing the Palestinian Authority. Is there any country in the Middle East who lets the enemies of the state openly attack the state like it happened in the Israeli Knesset? Israeli Arabs can freely criticize Israel. This is a fact. Israel will continue to be the everlasting home and safe haven of the Jews and also of its Christian Druze and even Arab minorities. The world needs to know that these facts and to understand that this is the fact and to understand that the people who would cynically put Christ at the checkpoint do not represent the real Christian voice in this region or anywhere else in the world. We all long for peace in the Holy Land, but not peace based on lies based on lies that can only lead to trouble for local Christians. Peace can come by supporting a state like Israel that uses democracy as its own favorite system, treat all minorities well, and allow them equality and all types of freedom. This is the type of state the Christian minority believing in which in a Jewish democratic state whom I represent want to see and support and wish it eternal lasting. This state fulfills the prophecies of the Jewish and Christian holy books and implements all moral values adopted by Western countries without difference between religion, gender, and race. The Islamic theology calling for killing Jews is not only harmful for the state and all its citizens, including minorities like Christians, its genocidal character is also of the lowest moral standards one can imagine, and it leads to the worst kind of violence against Jews and the state of Israel one can imagine, killing thousands of innocent civilians in brutal attacks. Again, where is the UN when it comes to justice and moral of Israel and persecuting Aramaic Christians in the Middle East as we see it today? It is much more important and effective to combat such a genocidal ideology than to condemn Israel every few months at the UN. As we can see, this violent Islamic ideology destroys whole nations, like in the case of Syria and Iraq today. How can Palestinians that live in Israel enjoy all type of freedom and rights, benefit from the system, and still be its enemy from their deepest heart? This position is immoral, to say at least. It reveals that the hatred of Israel and Jews has nothing to do with the state treats Arab, but how the Muslim Arabs see the Jews in their theology and ideology. Even though this horrible scenario is the case, Israel still protects and supports the people, culture, and language, and even religion of those who think and act immoral and against the country. Israel wants peace. With its neighbor and its enemy, it has proven since its establishment in 1948 that it wants to live in peace and harmony with its Arab neighbors. It is not logical or reasonable to think that a nation wants to live in war. Every nation on earth wants peace and prosperity, so does, of course, Israel. But if you are constantly provoked at war, how should peace come? Israel does not want wars. It hates violence and death. As Golda Meir stated, when peace comes, we will perhaps in time be able to forgive the Arabs for killing our sons, but it will be harder for us to forgive them for having forced us to kill their sons. Peace will come to the Middle East when the Arabs love their children more than they hate us. This is Golda Meir what said in 1957. No state in the world is perfect. We all know that. But Israel is doing its best to realize the highest moral standard, as we have seen. But not only has the state to act morally, but also its citizens, include the minorities. We wish that our Palestinian neighbors and those who criticize Israel, criticize or hate Israel, would do the same. We wish that Palestinians and their fellow Arabs were not united by hatred against Israel, the Jews, and respect the country. We are all the descendants of Abraham, the Arameans. If we want to live in peace, we must love our neighbors and our brothers. We love the Jews. We see them as brothers, and we hope for the day that our fellow citizens, the Palestinian and other Arab following Islam, see their terror and see their errors and stop hating Israel and its people and stop acting in harmful way. This is the way to act, and only then peace will come. If we believe in God, then we must listen and live accordingly to what the Bible tells us and tells Abraham and his descendants, the Jewish people. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. Israel is the apple of God's eye, and we must support his chosen people wherever we can. God bless Israel, the Jewish people, and the Christian Aramaic population persecuted today in the Middle East. Thank you.
You now have another break time for the next 15 minutes, so meet us back here, please, at 3:50 promptly. Thank you.